Hello and welcome to Trinity Grace Podcast, a podcast for the edification of believers through the recovery of confessional Christianity. My name is John Mark and I'm part of the media team here at Trinity Grace Church, and I'm here with our pastor, Oliver Allman-Smith. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, John Mark. Good to be with you again.
Today we're looking at the cult of personality and the destruction of real leadership. Could you explain this issue to us? It's part of the spirit of our age, which has maybe seeped into our local churches.
Absolutely, John Mark. What we're dealing with in our culture at large is a complete change, a shift change in our approach to leadership. Maybe even just a couple of generations back in the war years, we sought in leaders what we might call real statesmanship. We looked for leaders who had wisdom, leaders who had experience, leaders who had substance, leaders who could make decisions that folks could rely on as being wise. But nowadays, unfortunately, we don't look for leaders like that anymore. The days of the statesman are past, and now we have the consummate politician, somebody who is always looking for that soundbite, somebody who's always looking for that phrase. Now think about recent election campaigns and even more recently our response to the pandemic that we're facing. It all seems to have boiled down to tiny little phrases consisting of 2 or 3 sound bites that is supposed to summarize our entire response. And then it's presented by people with personality, people with zing, people with zip, people with drive, people who wear the right suits and look the right way. And then we buy into that. So this is where this idea of the cult of personality comes in. We want leaders who have personality, leaders who have charisma. It's leadership by the celebrity, the person who is famous for being famous. We see that in the church, don't we? Look at the way in which the big names, the big leaders are all the people with the big budgets and the big websites and the big publishing houses, and the days of the local church really, humanly speaking, are numbered as a result, because how can a pastor of a local church just with a small building and a small budget and perhaps limited ability, how can he compete with all of that?
And it may be one reason why so many people are moving away in the UK and in the West from the idea of local churches, and instead are all gathering together into far bigger churches which are far less local. They can cater to the needs of the people half as well, but are instead a far bigger group following this great personality. It seems a bit of a pattern there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's even worse than that, isn't it? Because the big groupings aren't even churches anymore. It's just a movement. So it's fronted up by a website or a YouTube channel or some kind of page or publishing house which is behind the ministry. And you have so-and-so introduced at a big conference, and he is the chairman and CEO of such and such a ministry. Of course, chairman, CEO, these are worldly terms. They're not biblical terms. We have one leader in the New Testament who has spiritual oversight, and that's the pastor, elder, overseer. That's it.
So how are we to tackle this issue in our local churches?
Recognizing the nature of the problem is really important. How are small churches going about the hunt for a new pastor, elder, overseer? Are they looking for somebody with personality, somebody who's married with the right number of children, somebody who looks right and talks right, somebody who's a nice guy, somebody, etc., etc.? If that's what they're looking for, we've lost before we've started. So we have to recognize the problem in and of itself. And then, as we're saying in these podcasts, John Mark, it's all about promoting confessional Christianity as a remedy to the problem at its source. So if you think about being confessional, one of the things that we're saying, amongst all the many, many other things, is that we are placing truth above personality. So in seeking to be confessional, our first question isn't, how great is the preacher? How much pazazz has he got? What's his personality like? Or even we can use more spiritual terminology like, how much fire is there in his preaching? Or how convincing is he? Or we're asking instead a different question. And we are saying, how confessional is the church? And that's a whole different question. And if we are being confessional at the core of our church, what we're saying is we're placing truth and doctrine, historic apostolic truth, over and above personality. We're placing truth before leadership. So what we're asking of our leadership then is, how committed to the truth is this leadership? We are measuring our leadership against the truth rather than handing over our view of the truth or our access to the truth, handing it over to these leaders with all their great personality and their gifts and so on.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's recognizing that although leadership is important, and of course the person is important, it's ultimately what Scripture tells us to look for, which is always the truth. Scripture's telling us, for example, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, there is a great explanation on what the bishop or the overseer should be like, and it's all just statements of truth. So is the leader going to measure up against that, or is he going to measure up against how successful he is in celebrity culture?
Absolutely.
Or whether the young people just like him?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's take that a step further, because what we're then saying is that it's the church's responsibility, the gathered church's responsibility, to hold its leaders to account for being faithful to that truth. So what an individual believer within a church or a congregation gathered in a church members meeting can do then is to hold the minister and his ministry accountable against the confession of faith and say, look, this is what the Bible teaches. Here we have it delineated in our confession of faith, and you're teaching this, this, or this, which seems to us to be contrary to this confession. Can you explain? Have you departed from the faith, or have we misunderstood? There is then a standard, a confessional standard, a biblical standard against which the church can hold the minister accountable.
And if they're just a normal believer, they're not a scholar of Scripture, how do we expect them to measure everything the preacher says against what the Scriptures say? So it's only sensible and helpful for them to have a confession which they can uphold as the truth of the Bible, and therefore measure everything they hear against that.
I think something we've said before, John Mark, isn't it, is that everybody has a confession of faith. But a church member whose confession of faith is merely what the previous minister taught me, then as you say, their confession of faith is going to be extremely limited. The previous minister will not have taught them the whole counsel of God, so there'll be massive gaps. The previous minister may not be orthodox in certain ways, so there'll be problems there. The previous minister may have different emphases and so on and so on. What we need is a confession of faith that isn't what the previous minister taught or even the present minister teaches, but what historic Orthodox Christianity has taught through the centuries. Surely that is a much safer and stronger position to be in. And by doing that, we cut out the cult of personality. It's not, I believe that because my pastor teaches me, but it's, I believe that because that is what my confessional orthodoxy has rooted me in. And I can see from what my pastor teaches me that is the biblical truth. It's very interesting in Acts 20 when Paul calls the Ephesian elders and he says to them, you must teach the people the whole counsel of God, just as I did. So Paul taught them the whole counsel of God. They are then to teach their people the whole counsel of God. How do we know what that whole counsel is? No minister can teach verse by verse through the entire Bible. And even if he did, he may still not teach the whole counsel of God. But if we have a summary of confessional orthodoxy, which has been handed down generation to generation, then we can teach the whole counsel of God. We can root our people in this. And one thing we try and do here at Trinity Grace is to encourage the members to root their convictions in the confession and not in the leadership. So we consciously try to short circuit the cult of personality here. We do that by means of having a genuine plurality of elders and parity of elders. We also do that by elevating the importance of the church members meeting, as we find in chapter 26, paragraph 7. But we do it as well by emphasizing the confession before the people and saying, look, we're all accountable to the same standard of truth.
Amen. Thank you for that. Well, thank you for tuning into Trinity Grace Podcast, and you can find us on YouTube and Facebook at Trinity Grace Church Ramsbottom, and we're online at trinitygracechurch.net. Thanks again, and bye for now.